There you go. Okay. All
Bruce,
right.
where do you put the recording?
I put it on, I store it in at YouTube. So I have basically it's stored by Zoom on my computer, and I put some of them on the Google Drive on my Google Drive, but it takes up an awful lot of memory. But I have a YouTube channel which I send you guys the links to every week in that PowerPoint, and all of these, a lot of these are at YouTube. Sometimes they tell me that there's copyright infringement, and those ones I don't leave at YouTube because we could get in trouble for that.
Sure.
They're pretty tough on that copyright infringement. I heard a guy who was trying to our lessons, and he did like 3 bars from a common piece of music, and they kicked him out. He was,
Yeah.
and they've got a way of searching this stuff out down to 3 notes, 3 bars.
Yep. So let's see, what are we doing here? 17. Okay, we have a few minutes. I want to make sure that John and John are on. I want to get a co-host today. So there's Booker. Is it so? Ripu, you met us through Booker, is that right?
That is correct.
And I don't really know much about Booker. Is he?
Booker's my stepdad.
Oh, okay. All right.
There we go. That's it.
It's funny,
That's
it's connections through connections, right?
Yeah.
right. Booker told me about Scott's presentations. He says, yeah, and he sent me his link to his talks.
Got it. Okay. You want to go skiing tomorrow, Scott? I'm going to go up to Mount Hood, up to Timberline.
I actually going to try and go up St. Helens tomorrow. We'll see.
Oh, okay, good. Well, if it falls through, I could try
Yeah,
that
that'll
too.
be fun. Yeah, okay.
Are you vaccinated?
1 shot.
Okay.
Second one on Friday.
Okay. Well,
2
that's
weeks after second shot.
Okay.
Yep.
We're getting there.
I got that today.
super.
There's a 3rd shot now.
Yeah, maybe when we get out, when we all, yeah, is there? Yeah, there's going to be.
Yeah, 2 weeks after the 2nd shot, pour yourself some good booze and
There we go.
celebrate that you're immune.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking is maybe
Semi-immune.
once we all get vaccinated and things start to look safe, maybe we can get all of us science, Portland people at least, science for the board people out of my deck, and we can have a toast. Okay. Well, this should be an interesting talk. Ripudaman Malhotra earned his PhD at the University of Southern California and then spent his career at SRI International, specializing on energy-related issues. He published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and several technical monographs. In 2010, he co-authored A Cubic Mile of Oil, The Looming Energy Crisis and Options for Averting It. The book is a citizen's guide to energy and a call for an informed public debate on energy, arguably the biggest challenge we face. In 2005, he was named an SRI Fellow. In 2015, he received the Storch Award for the American Chemical Society's Division of Energy and Fuels. In 2018, he was named a Fellow of the American Chemical Society. In 2019, he was inducted into SRI's Hall of Fame. Ripudaman Malhotra. You can.
Thank you very much. And really appreciate everybody taking some time to talk about this issue that we talked. I gave a brief presentation, my rant, a few weeks ago. I believe a few of you were there, but there may be some who were not. Anyhow, this talk is independent of that. Whether you heard it or not, it shouldn't matter. Do I have the privilege to share the screen?
Yes, you do.
We see it.
I'm going to minimize the pictures here and move them to the side. Okay. So I'm calling today's presentation Arguing for Nuclear Power. I'm not going to keep it a surprise. That is the issue, my preferred way of how we should be addressing the climate and energy challenge. Oh, why isn't it advancing? There. So I am not going to talk a whole lot about the climate crisis that we have. That's the premise of this talk, that climate change is real. It's not a hoax, and it is happening. What is also known is that energy consumption is the main driver of climate change. Why? Because energy use is essential for our sustenance, and yet 80% of it is derived from fossil sources. So when we use them, we end up emitting a greenhouse gas. And urgent action is needed now. Now, we have been talking about this for a long time now. This is showing you since after the Rio, which one was it? I think the earlier one of the, so from 93 onwards, the amount of different fuels that we have used to get our energy. This is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. They do us a great service of compiling data every year. I've just changed the units to cubic miles of oil. So this green thing is the cubic this is oil. Here it is natural gas. Coal is up top here. So these are the three main fossils. But the others are here in between. There is the nuclear energy, hydroelectric, and then other renewables. So in the 2000s or 1990s, or even in the 2000s, the amount of wind and solar and geothermal was really a very, very small, minuscule. And you can see that it has really grown more than 10 times since then. But that dramatic growth in percentage growth does not reflect in absolute terms how much energy we are getting from these non-fossil sources. We still are getting most of it from coal, oil, and natural gas. And we have to get away from that soon. So with that premise, the urgent action is now, because if we don't do it by 2035 or 2050, we really have to get to zero emissions. It's not going to happen, and it takes a long time. So we are really cutting it short because we had not taken the urgent actions that were necessary a while back. So what's the path forward? One of the paths that has been proposed and talked about, and I tend to agree with it, is we should try to use electricity for everything, electrify everything, transportation, industry, the built environment, meaning our heating our homes or the lighting and entertainment and communications, which is largely done with electricity at the moment. But what we also need to do is produce that electricity from carbon-free sources. This is what the Green New Dealers also would like us to do. They just that the methods they propose, I would submit, are not going to cut it. And that there is therefore the necessity of really expanding nuclear power. Now, one of the reasons for emphasizing nuclear power and provoking this discussion today is that you say nuclear power and many environmentalists immediately throw the thing off and say, well, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to talk about it. And it has really caused a lot of problems because mainly it is a result of conflating nuclear power with nuclear weapons. And a lot of the problems come from that. I'll be addressing some of these issues in a few minutes. Let's take a look at where the CO2 emissions are coming from. As I said, electricity and transportation are the two big sources. And electricity goes into mainly the building operations. That is the heating, lighting, ventilation of buildings, and the transportation, automobiles, planes, cars, trucks, all that. Some of the industrial processes also require fair amounts of carbon sources. And the heating that is done in the industry is generally done by using methane or coal. And then there are some materials like steel, iron. When you refine the iron ore, you use carbon as a necessary ingredient, because that's the one, the carbon in the coal is the one that's the reduction of the iron ore, which is the iron oxide, into the metal. So it is chemically required, but all these things end up producing CO2. So even if we electrify everything and try to get our transportation, which is people are talking about mostly, there'll still be the industry and building materials sectors left. And there's a lot of innovation that is needed at the moment to how to get these things decarbonized. How do we get steel from not using carbon, but maybe using hydrogen, which we could produce from clean electricity? Or how could we provide the heat needed for some of the industrial processes, not using carbon, not by burning methane, but by using, if not electricity or hydrogen flame, or really hot gases out of a nuclear reactor. That's a possibility also. Talk about those in a bit. But I wanted to lay out that doing the transportation is a big part of it, and it should deserve our attention, and it is deserving. And everybody talks about getting electric cars and making sure that we do our part. But that's not enough for two reasons. One, that we are not addressing these other things, and B, we don't know how our electricity is being produced, and so how we will be charging our cars. And we want to make sure that the source of that is also clean, i.e. carbon-free. Now, one other response that I have seen many times is, oh, we have just way too many people, we just need to cut the population. Well, whose population are you going to cut? It's the part of the question. The people who, there's a strong correlation between energy consumption and affluence or standard of living, or the United Nations Human Development Index scale, which has as its components things like life expectancy, infant mortality, per capita GNI, education levels. So they make this all these factors and combine them together. You can look at it individually also, and the graph basically takes this form. You have plotted over here how countries have risen on the, have been plotted against the Human Development Index, and the amount of electricity, energy, primary energy consumption in this case, but I can do it with kilowatt hours, I can do it with many other things as well. There is a dramatic rise in the beginning, after which line kind of plateaus. That means consuming beyond a certain, like 1,000 gallons on this graph, doesn't get you a whole lot more in terms of the development index, but it certainly gets you out of poverty. Between 1980 and 2004, China lifted about 600 million people, that's twice the US population, out of abject poverty, and reduced infant mortality from about 2,000 a day to less than 700 a day. Now, 700 is still a fairly high number, but worldwide, the infant mortality rate today stands at about 17,000 a day. Put that in perspective, 17,000 is about the number of people who died in the tsunami in the wake of the earthquake in Fukushima, near there. So imagine a tsunami like that coming every day and affecting children under the age of 5. And it's a result strictly of lack of enough energy and getting to people, because energy is at the basis for lots of things, providing food, providing clean water, providing sanitation, providing transportation, providing education opportunities. You need to get them into the world economy. And we are wasting so much of human potential because we just don't allow these children, we don't give them the opportunity to flourish. What a waste. And so lifting that, that's what you need to look at first. So I used 2050 as a target because by then we need to be entirely carbon free. So let's see how much energy would we need by then. And using this graph that I was showing in the previous slide, how much to afford everybody in the world, a decent amount of energy to lead healthy, productive lives. So make some assumptions. You need about estimate about 9 billion people by then. Already we are about 7+. The desired minimum per capita energy consumption to ensure the Human Development Index about 0.9 is, as I showed in the previous graph, about 1,000 gallons of oil equivalent per year. I'm not saying we'll be using gallons of oil, but that's just a unit of energy, as much energy as a gallon of oil provides. It is still less than half the US consumption, and it's comparable to what's in Europe and Japan. Translated, it all amounts to about 9 trillion gallons of oil worth. Or in my cubic mile oil units, it is north of 8 cubic miles of oil per year. In terms of electricity, if I use 1 gallon of oil gives us about 12 kilowatt hours of energy. So if we look at just the primary energy content in physics textbook, the BTUs of gallon of oil and the BTUs of the weight electricity, a gallon of oil is often equated with about 36 to 38 kilowatt hours. But when you start with a gallon of oil, you don't get 38 kilowatt hours of electricity. You only get about 12. That's because of the inefficiencies of the way we can produce electricity. So this means that if I have a process that gives me kilowatt hours, then 1 kilowatt hour of electricity has displaced 1 gallon of oil. I don't need 38 kilowatt hours to displace 1 gallon of oil. That's how I get to a somewhat of a smaller number, a more reachable target in terms of kilowatt hours than if I stuck with the 38 kilowatt hours per gallon of oil. So this way, if I'm just stepping through this, you can confirm my calculations if you want. It's about 108,000 terawatt hours. That's about 4.5 times the current global production of electricity of 24,000 terawatt hours. So we have to increase that for that much. And it's not something that we can just reduce it or save it. We certainly shouldn't waste it. We certainly should try to use as much of the resource that we have and use it most efficiently. I'm not denying the importance of efficiency gains or conservation, but conservation and efficiency are not sufficient to provide enough energy for the world. So how many terawatts do I need to install? Well, if I install something that is available 100% of the time at 100 capacity, that's 100% capacity factor, that amounts to about 12.3 terawatts. Well, if I have about each watt is installed at about $5 a watt, that's a pretty high price, but we normally do much better than that. And look at the investments over the next 30 years, this would come out to about $2 trillion per year, or 2.7% of the gross world product. But it has to be a commitment and consistent for 30 years. We could do it. It's doable. So that's it, but we don't have a whole lot of time left to deal with it. We have wasted a whole lot of time. A word about renewable energy sources, which are the favorite. I put the air quotes, I put the quotes around it because I use this term somewhat advisedly. First of all, renewable energy is a misnomer. It's a marketing ploy. Why do I say that? Energy is never renewed. It always dissipates.
Yeah.
Okay, so renewable energy is a great thing. It does produce renewable jobs because these plants need to be constantly renewed also. Certain sources have been termed renewable because their consumption does not deplete the source. Well, the source is already depleted by the time you get to the energy. These sources will last as long as the sun shines. So that's why they're called renewable. But harvesting that solar energy will require non-renewable resources. And sometimes a lot of it. We'll look at those, what the requirements of those are to produce it at scale. It's one thing to produce enough for, okay, I've got a home, I can do it for myself. But if I want everybody to be doing it, how much silicon do I need? How much steel do I need? We'll look at some of those things in a minute. That's where the problem comes. It's not that the sources, so the sun will last another 4 or 5 billion years, and we probably won't survive anywhere near that time, nonetheless. And if longevity is the criterion, then nuclear power should also be termed renewable, and then be accorded the same kind of credits, the renewable energy credits, which are a major revenue source for wind and solar farms. That's what makes them economical. That's what people say, oh, the prices are dropping. Well, that's because they're not really costing them correctly. They are not adding any costs for what it takes to integrate these intermittent sources into our current energy system, nor do they account for all the different revenue streams. There are certain challenges for this all renewable scenario. And first of all is that wind and solar are intermittent sources. I'm not talking about hydro, mainly because hydroelectricity is, I think we have close to saturated it. The world produces about 0.2 cubic mile oil worth of electricity from hydro. And I don't think there are enough rivers left in the world that could be dammed. You could at most double what we have today, but that would also just by doubling it, you go from 0.2 to 0.4. So if you really want to do something, you have to look at beyond hydro power of this kind. There are applications for hydro. There are different kinds of hydro, run-of-the-river hydros, but the amount of energy you can extract from them is limited. Capacity factor for wind and solar is often less than 30%. The capacity factor please interrupt me by unmuting yourself and saying if there's a term that needs immediate clarification. I don't want to spend too much time clarifying things if people are following it, but if there is something, we can certainly do bring to my attention. Capacity factor is something that I use a lot. So I'll just, it means, look at the nameplate when somebody says it's a 5 kilowatt system. Well, its capacity factor will be the amount of energy that it produces in a year, divided by if it produced the 5 kilowatt entirely for the full year. So the ratio of what it actually gives that's the nameplate power integrated over the time. So power times time is the energy. So how much energy you get from that, that's how I get the capacity factor. And since the capacity factor is less than 30%, so my installment that I was talking about of 12 terawatts now jumps to 30 or 40 terawatts. And so the investments they go by the watts, they go by the powers of the system, how large a system you're installing. So you really build an overcapacity to compensate for the fact that they are not going to be operating all the time. And it's not just because the sun is down, but even when it's not the nameplate capacity is at the noontime, at its peak performance. And, so there is a less than optimal performance in the early hours and late evenings, and the maximum is in the middle of the day. Then, because the energy source is dilute, the materials that are required to harvest, that is a lot. It takes several hundred tons of steel and concrete for every megawatt of solar or wind installation. If you do the thing, I will show you in a second, it'll strain the global supply chains for things like copper, steel, cement, glass, aluminum, you name it. And I'm not talking about the rare earths or some of those other more exotic materials whose supplies are also extremely limited. And then a big question that so far the renewable people have not addressed very head on is the amount of storage that is required. Intermittency means that you must have storage on terawatt-hour scale. Currently, it is provided by, that we have the grid in the back to back us up. And the grid is running mostly with gas-fired turbines. Gas-fired turbines are used because they can be ramped up very quickly and shut down very quickly, so they can be used to track. But these are not the most efficient use of gas. The gas-fired turbines are a lot less efficient than the combined cycle natural gas plants. If you really wanted to use natural gas to produce electricity, you would use dedicated combined cycle natural gas, that's a CCNG. And then you could use it for 100% of the time, and your greenhouse gas emissions would be less had you not used photovoltaics and backed them up with gas-fired turbines. That's how it works out. But we don't count those emissions towards photovoltaics. And then industrial development really requires reliable supply 24/7. They don't shut down. They really need to be operating all the time. And there is a lot of investment, and you don't want your those investment dollars to be sitting idle. That would be like stranding the assets over there, and that's not the most efficient way of the use of the dollars. Here's a slide that shows the materials requirement for some of the renewables compared to nuclear. So for solar voltaic, so there's this things for the cement, glass, steel, some others. So for photovoltaics, you can see how much for the same amount of terawatt hours for every terawatt hours, the thousands of tons that are needed. Compare that to the nuclear, which is minuscule. Wind is about 10 times as large as nuclear, and solar is about 14 times as large. Let's consider a scenario, say I'm using the minimum 30 terawatt scenario. And I'm going to use 30 terawatts by 20 terawatts of wind and 10 terawatts of solar. This is much like what Professor Jacobson at Stanford has been proposing in his 100% renewable scenarios. There are lots of the papers on that. Many people have talked about it. And I'd say, well, how much steel is that required for this scenario? You need, there are 25,000 million metric tons of steel. That's 25 billion metric tons of steel. I'm using million metric tons because that's the unit for a lot of things. So that's why MMTs are there. So that's, if I wrap it up in 10 years to get to the 20 terawatts of wind, I'll need 2,500 MMTs per year. At the moment, the world steel production is only 1.9 mm, 1,900 MMT instead. So that doesn't even match the 2,500. So if I want to do that, I have to more than double the steel production to feed this new demand of very fast wind installations. And then because these turbines last about 20 years only, it means I need to be replacing things at about 5% per year. That means the constant replacement will be on the order of slightly less than what we are of the current world steel production. And producing steel is, you just don't, you have to be digging a lot of iron from a variety of places. You will require, and we don't have the, if we use it the way we are doing it right now, we'll also use billions of tons of coal for that, which we don't want to use. So we also need to start thinking about how we're going to produce the steel and concrete without using carbon. Let's look at the area requirement for this wind farm. We have about 5 million square kilometers is the area that will be required. What does 5 million square kilometer look like? Well, it's about half the US area. Now, of course, I'm not saying cover half the US area just to provide, this is for the worldwide, but if I want to see, that's the amount of land. Look on a globe, US stands are pretty big, it's half of that land is to be covered with windmills in the world. Generally, these has to be, these for optimal performance, they have to be located at places where wind is constant and high, and those are generally the ridges. And as we deplete those ridges with and take those out and put in roads along the side for servicing, there's a lot of land use change, and we will be encroaching lots of other species habitats. And encroaching habitats in wildlife increases the risk of pandemic. That's one thing that we have learned with this COVID. So that's the serious consideration. Let's look at the battery storage. I did not talk about the concrete, and if it just adds up, it's just as bad or worse. I want to get to another part, which is the storage. And everyone's really, all the articles, there's been a lot of articles about electric cars and batteries in the press lately. And yes, the prices of the batteries are falling down. And that's great news. They are getting better and they are getting more affordable, and that's all good. But if I need to provide storage for this 30 terawatt system, I need at least 4 days worth of storage in the back. That's like 100 hours. So I need storage on the order of 3,000 terawatt hours. Well, chemically, I can look at how much lithium I need per megawatt hour. It's about 260 tons. We know that. So that's just from the chemistry and the potentials that lithium has, the lithium battery can give us, and that. So this is just basic, from the basic principles. You could probably improve, you couldn't improve a whole lot above them. We generally get worse as we go on. So this is better than what these Tesla batteries are at the moment. So looking at some of the best case scenarios, I need about 980 million metric tons. Well, how much is the lithium global production last year or year before last? It was 60,000 metric tons. That's 0.06 MMT. And that's barely enough for 5 million Nissan Leaf cars out of a global fleet of 2 billion cars. So it's a long ways to go. I'm not saying that there isn't enough lithium in the world, but if we want to ramp up, we need to ramp up the lithium production enormously. hundreds of folds.
Do we really need 100 hours of storage for all 30 terawatts of this hypothetical system? I agree with your basic premise that there may not be enough lithium, but it seems like that may be overstating it somewhat.
I think actually that's understating it. You know, I have cut it back considerably from what is required. When you do it, look at localized, smaller systems, you need a lot longer storage systems. Just as per se, you begin to require about, often there is a down. And so here what you will require is, if there is excess of things elsewhere, like in Texas, it was gone for more than 4 days. Here we had a power outages lasting longer than, easily a week or so, that you could be without the source of that. And so the question is, how large an area is affected, and can you supply from your neighbors? Well, when Texas was having the problem, so were the neighboring states. We didn't have the connections, but that's aside. And I think 100 hours is a very small amount. People often go with much larger amounts.
Well, but I mean, Texas is basically on their own grid, right?
That's their own grid. But so I don't want to confound it with Texas, but I'm just pointing out that when Texas was suffering, so were the neighboring states. They had the same problem of natural gas supply shortages. And I think 100 hours is not a. There are other scenarios like using pumped hydro. You could use that. There are other storage systems other than lithium-ion batteries. I think lithium-ion battery is good for a power surge, to be able to quickly produce the power. But if you want to store the energy, you may be better off using, a kind of a hybrid system. Do the energy storage based on water or compressed gas. There are ways to do that. But in all these cases, I think we need to look at the total material requirements of the system. And I haven't seen that done adequately. And when I do this, it comes out that there are orders of magnitude of discrepancy between what the supply chain looks like and what is needed. And we need to do it quickly. That means we need to turn it on a dime. Because the longer we wait to start, then then the steeper will be the demand at 10 years from now. So that is what brings me to nuclear, because the energy density of various fuels, if I plot them on a scale, this is a cartoon I pulled from, I didn't put the source on it. I had it on my other slide. The fuel energy density of sugar, coal, fat, these are in megajoules per kilogram, gasoline. But you come to uranium, and you need reams and reams of paper to print if you want to print on a linear thing, because nuclear has about 16,000 times the energy density of coal. So all the benefits of nuclear power really come down from the fact that it is extremely energy dense, which means you can do with 1,000 tons what would require you to do with billions of tons. And this high energy density also means you have a much smaller environmental footprint, not just in terms of where the nuclear power plant is situated, but also in terms of all the digging that you have to do and the natural environment that you will have to encroach to get the resources. A simple schematic of the most common pressurized water-cooled reactor. The energy in the nuclear power comes from the breaking up, the fission of uranium-235, which is the fissile nucleus. That means when we hit it with a neutron from a source, it breaks up into two pieces, comparable pieces, barium, krypton, strontium. Some of these common lighter elements are formed that are also very radioactive, and they are also emitting neutrons, more neutrons, which could then come in contact with or cause the fission of another uranium-235. And it's it's balanced, but this heat is then extracted with water. And you can keep it in a pressurized system with a controlled one, or there's the boiling water scheme. There's slight variation on it. But there are several, I want to draw attention to the fact that there are several loops here. That the primary loop of the heat exchanging that's going on in the, that water just stays over here. It does not communicate with the water that's coming out to drive the turbine. And that water also is not communicating with the water that is used to cool and run the, to make sure that there is a temperature gap and there is a heat flow and all that. So the rejection of heat, that's also a different one. And the water that is intake from the lake, that's pretty much a constant loop. A small amount of what is vaporized over here in these, those are the things that are the big things, the cooling towers that we see. What you see coming out of it is just water vapor, a small amount of water vapor. The rest of the water is just condensed and kept in that loop over there, which then communicates with the other two. So it's only heat that is moving from here, from a very hot zone through stages to this and out. So the water that then goes back out to the river or something this is actually the intake side. Small amount of it then therefore has to be rejected also, but most of it is kept inside in a constant loop. Is slightly warmer than the one that's coming in. Nuclear power has the lowest of CO2 emissions over a life cycle. So if I look at the levelized CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour, coal of different varieties of almost 900 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Natural gas combined cycle is, there are 400 or something, but the gas turbines are up here, which is about 700. Photovoltaic is, so that's what I was telling you, the natural gas combined cycle, which is much better, but what we use for backup power is this variety. So it has a lot more, but you run this twice as long or sometimes, so it depends on what the demand is. The bunch of others, here's the photovoltaic for the residents or photovoltaic at a utility scale in the 40s or high 40s. Concentrated solar power is also around in the 40s. Wind is much lower, is only 14. And that's because it's not that during the production of electricity, wind and solar are emitting CO2. This is the CO2 that was emitted in the production of the facility, in the maintenance and the operation over the life cycle of it. That's the amount of CO2 that was emitted. And nuclear compares favorably with all these. We're really afraid of radiation. That's one of the biggest things. And we have really, we meaning the scientific community also has to take some responsibility for scaring everybody about the dangers of radiation. A lot of it started with when there were these tests in the atmospheric tests for the nuclear weapons. And there was radiation falling all out with fallout and all that. And prior to that, the world had seen horrendous tragics from the atomic bombs. And that image is seared in our brains. And the theory that developed was, well, radiation causes DNA damage and it's lasting forever. And we don't know at what point it changes. We don't know at which ones of these are going to be cumulative. So all radiation is bad. And you have to go to as low as you can achieve it. And so forgetting for a moment that we have evolved with a lot of radiation. We are always living on Earth. We get exposed to 3 to 7 millisieverts per year of radiation. What I'm showing, this is a graphic from Dr. Wade Allison. The red circle shows what's 40,000 millisieverts. That's a dosage of radiation. It's fatal to a tumor. But in radiotherapy, we generally administer about 20,000 millisieverts per month. It is non-fatal to the healthy tissue, but most of the cancer tissues, because they're multiplied, they begin to die with those. And the green circle is what Dr. Allison says is a kind of a safe threshold. This is as harmless as reasonably safe. It is still reasonably safe of 100 millisieverts per month. He has an acronym for it, as I forget the thing, to some reasonable safety. ALARA is the public policy limit, which is as reasonable, as low as reasonably achievable. I think this is as high as reasonably safe. That's his acronym. Yes, we need to have but the ALARA limit is the little black dot within that. That's the 1 millisievert per year or less than that. You know, that's what the nuclear industry is guided by, and they have to reduce it down to that level. It really is an overkill by a factor of 1,000. Despite all this, nuclear energy remains the safest energy source of all. It saves lives compared to all other. If you're going to be getting energy, and if you're going to be using coal, you can, on average, think about causing about 160 premature fatalities from emissions, not the CO2, but the pollutions, the pollutants that it causes with the soot and NOx, the nitrogen oxides and other things that cause respiratory damage. Oil has also fairly high, 36. Natural gas is much better, much cleaner burning, only 4. Hydros, if you count the one big tragic one, it explodes, but hydro is otherwise fairly safe. Hydro really requires a lot of displacement of people in the beginning. Solar is about 0.44, wind 0.15, nuclear 0.04, and I've drawn this red line on it. I'll take a second. But even without that red line, you can see it's 0.04 is compares favorably with everybody else. This 0.04 fatality per terawatt hour includes in it 4,000 fatalities that may result from the Chernobyl accident. That was what the nuclear agency at that time in early 2000s had thought about. In 2008, the UN agency that looks at these things updated their Chernobyl report and decided that, no, you cannot detect it. It's really undetectable. So if I cut that down, it gets to 0.0013. So as we turn off nuclear power plants and install anything else, mostly coal, as Germany has done, or natural gas, as California is doing, we are actually subjecting or will be losing more lives prematurely than if we had just left the clean nuclear power plants running. I want to take a few minutes. How are we doing with time? I think we have about, maybe I will go through this fairly quickly.
Yeah, we're about 45 minutes in, so yeah.
No, I want to have people give, I know it's, there will be lots of questions. I anticipate that.
Yep.
So, okay, let's look at the three big accidents that have happened. And I'll just go through what really happened. The 3 Mile Island, Harrisburg, 1979. Well, there was loss of cooling and had a partial meltdown of the core. The containment vessel held. There was some radioactive gases were relieved. No casualties. No ill effects from the exposure. The exposure was less than any of those numbers that I was talking about. It was less than what someone would get from an X-ray, chest X-ray. So Chernobyl, which happened, but one important thing to remember is that this happened, unfortunately, within weeks of the movie, The China Syndrome. And that coincidence really was a disaster for the nuclear power. It caused a lot of public opinion changed. But I think it's our response to the fear of radiation that is worse than the radiation. And there'll be examples of that coming up some more also in Fukushima. Chernobyl was really a disaster. There was a steam explosion that happened during a flawed safety test that they were running. They shouldn't have been running. If you're interested in more about it, you'll have to read it in my book, or we can talk about it another time. But one of the things is that we don't build reactors like that. It was in the Soviet Union, and they had built reactors that had no containment. So the roof was blown off. And the fire, as oxygen contacted the hot graphite in the core, released more radioactivity and exposed 600,000 people. 50 workers died from acute radiation exposure, and about 231 suffered radiation illness. The International Atomic Energy Agency was at that time in 89, 90s. They calculated there might be about 4,000 additional cancers among the exposed population. As such, in the exposed population, because cancer happens to be not a very uncommon disease, 120,000 cases of cancer are to be anticipated. But any additional cancer is definitely an additional. We don't want that. Get that. Let's talk about Fukushima. Well, there was the earthquake, and the plant shut down according to plan because it sensed the earthquakes, it shut it down. It lost power, and so that means and the connection from the neighboring things, it lost power from that also. And then so they had to turn to their backup plan, which is the diesel generators on site. For some reason, these diesel generators were located well below where the tsunami was going to hit, below the, at the lower levels, which was something that was pointed out many times to them, but they hadn't moved them out. They got flooded, and so couldn't keep the reactor cool. And so there was fuel meltdown. But the containment held. The containment vessel held, but because there was hydrogen resulting from it, they had to release the hydrogen outside the containment area periodically. But then hydrogen and air, they do form explosive mixtures. And that's why in the secondary confinement, there were those explosions that we saw on TV. And that led to some release of some radioactivity. Over 100,000 people were displaced because of that. Now, of course, tsunami killed about 17,000 people in the first shot. The radiation levels that were detected were between 3 and 7 millisieverts per month in the neighboring areas. And compared to some where the ambient could be as high as 200 millisieverts per month. And people survive and people and thrive. We have that, but so there was not that, it was the panicky response that really caused about 1,500 lives that were lost due to the mental stress from forced evacuation and the anxiety, not from radiation. Nobody has died from radiation over there. Some of the common objections to nuclear power is, oh, what are you going to do with the waste? Well, first of all, it's a matter of term. I don't call it a waste. 90+% of the original fuel value is still in that. It's a resource. Second, the waste that we talk about, this is it's a solid pellet inside a steel rod, inside an assembly. They're kept in a concrete cask, and these are passively cooled. There's just air flowing through that's keeping them cool, and people can walk right up to it. These are at the site. So initially, when you pull them out of the reactor after some time, you keep for the rods are very, very hot, and you keep them in a swimming pool kind of a thing. It's a large pool of water. About 20 feet of water is needed to prevent the radiation from hurting the people around, who are the workers around, and B, also to provide adequate cooling. But after some time, the radioactivity decays, and these rods are then pulled out. These assemblies are then moved into these dry concrete casks. And it's a solid, it's not going anywhere. It's not the green goop that's flowing down as we've seen in Simpson episodes. And it hasn't hurt anyone. And actually, this is a resource because the next generation of reactors could use it as the fuel to produce more power. There are many of these, there are many designs for using them. I'm going to talk about one of these briefly. These are the molten salt reactors. They were developed in Oak Ridge National Lab in the 1960s. There was so these run as, excuse me. So this was a test reactor. They were just testing out the scheme of the molten salt, see if the salt in which, so there's a mixture of lithium fluoride and beryllium fluoride, the uranium fluoride dissolved in it. So as the uranium, and then you can, maybe better to show it with the next slide. We'll have the diagram and I'll talk about it. These are breeder reactors, which means it's a blanket of a fuel that is not fissile, but is what we call fertile. So like uranium 232 is not fissile, but it's fertile. When uranium 233 is fissile. So if you get to uranium 233, you can then with neutron break it into two, but a uranium 232 being fertile can take the neutron, become 233 and then become fissile. Similarly with plutonium, you have those, they have some of the 238 is fertile, it'll take, but then 239, it's fissile, it'll also break and produce a lot of energy. And these molten salt reactors were designed to be passively safe. That the molten salts, it's because of that, it's already a liquid, it doesn't develop cracks, it's easier to manage, to take the impurities out of it. It doesn't develop those crystal defects, which are one of the causes for not running the nuclear rods, uranium oxide rods, for a very long time, just 5% of consumption, and you have to start worrying about neutron imbalancing. So, and they are also, they are walk-away safe design. So if they are, let me just show you here what happens in one of these. This is with the thorium. Thorium is another metal that is available, occurs very widely in the world. And it's a fertile nucleus. It is not fissile to begin with. It has a very, very long half-life, 14 billion years. Pretty much half the world's originally produced thing is still around. So the salt is dissolved, the fissile material, the fusion, or that's going to, the fission that's going to take place is going to take place in this region over here. And there are some control rods to balance, to control the process. And outside, oops, outside that there's the, there's a blanket of the thorium, and inside is there where the nuclear reaction is taking place. And the neutrons, as they're coming out, are being absorbed by the thorium, producing uranium-233, which is then bled in. So from thorium, you get to uranium, which is then fissile. And then the liquid is kept in here. If it begins to go awry, the liquid could flow out. But normally it is kept by actively cooling this little bit over here at the junction and keeping the salt as a plug so that it remains in here. But if something goes wrong and things are getting too hot, then, or if you lose power for some reason, the plug melts and the whole salt just falls down into a large it spreads out as in a concrete floor in a pool over there, and it is no longer can sustain the nuclear reaction. So it shuts itself off. In fact, that was the way people tested it over and over again in Oak Ridge, because they didn't want to be working over the weekends and said, well, if it's failed safe, why don't we just walk away from it? Let's see what happens Monday, and then we can restart it. So they did that for more than 4 years, or 3-4 years. It stayed, they operated it. The objective at that time was to show that it can be operated. They did not have this breeder blanket around it. What they were doing was putting sensors to measure, do you have enough neutron flux to maintain it? And they did not have the power block either. That wasn't the objective. But this is now something that has been developed and being talked about and produced. 12 or so different countries have already made some variation of these reactors. And because it's all already a very high melting liquid, doesn't require go into very high pressures. There is no concrete dome needed to contain the high pressure. The liquid fuel precludes the problems with the cladding failures. The longer hold time inside means that we can really burn the fissile material to near completion. The long-lived actinides that are the bane of the current once through nuclear reactors, we can just burn them through to only the fission products, which are those lighter elements, which are very radioactive, but their radioactivity dies off, and also because they're very radioactive, in a much shorter time, about 200 to 300 years is all that we needed to contain it. And now, because you're operating at high temperatures, you can produce high temperature steam for greater efficiency, as well as use this to drive processes like desalination. If you want to produce hydrogen, if you want to produce concrete, those things become possible. It's an urgent task ahead at the moment for us, but I think overcoming public opposition to nuclear power is absolutely essential. I would hope that they can create an Office of Energy Education, thank you, and public outreach to, that would be, I would like to see that happen. I think among the specific actions that I like to see is that we first of all stop closing functional nuclear power plants. That's just, if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is you stop digging. And we seem to be continuing to dig ourselves in deeper and deeper in the holes. We have to start giving nuclear power plants the credits that are given to renewable plants. Start building these walk-away safe nuclear power plants. And one of the ways we can make things economically viable also is fix the current electricity pricing. They do this based on auctions that look at only the marginal cost of production. So what will be the cost of the next kilowatt hour, not what is going to be the system cost. And these really skew the market and decrease the reliability. We need to start innovating a lot of new processes as we try to electrify industrial processes. Can we have green processes for steel, cement, fuels? How about some hydrogen? How about even if we want to, because so much carbon is already in the air and that we really need to, after 2050, start bringing it down. That means we need to put it, carbon capture has to be integrated into this our thinking as well. But carbon capture is also energy intensive. Right now, we don't have enough energy to justify using a lot of carbon capture. But I think that'll become even more important, and getting something like nuclear power to do that, and then use the carbon for something else. Maybe produce hydrogen out of it. So I want to thank you for your attention. This picture of my book here. I summarize in 3 bullet points the 300+ pages of the book. Number 1, don't waste. It's a very precious commodity. Be informed, read about it, read the book, get involved. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to your representatives. And the books were kind of old, but I do maintain updates to it on my blog, which is cmo-ripu.blogspot.com. And I welcome you to browse through it and read about it. And
Thank you.
so stop sharing right now. Let's take questions.
Thanks. That's a very interesting talk. Can I first let me just if we could look at a couple questions in the chat. Maybe I'll read those out. Amy and Jake, is deaths per terawatt hour really the metric we want to measure? There are other fates that are unacceptable that aren't death. For example, I think of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Could you comment on that?
No, it's just, I mean, that's one of the things. I'm not saying that that's the only one that you want to focus on. But again, exclusion zones also, the exclusion zones sometimes are high because of our response, our fear, our unfounded fear, which is based on this. I didn't talk about the linear no threshold theory, but that's what has guided this, that every bit of radiation is bad for us. But if we get to be some reasonable about it, we don't need those exclusion zones to be that large.
Yep. Okay. Then another question was, Japan is going to release about 1.3 million tons of Fukushima radioactive water, and surrounding countries are upset.
I know, but it's the best solution. It is indeed the best solution. Let me take a few minutes to talk about it because it's been in the news. I just read it also, so it's very timely. So they have been collecting this. What is this water? The radioactive water. So it's the tritium is in there is what's really the problem. They have scrubbed the water to remove all the other elements that they could. So that they have. But tritium is an isotope of hydrogen. It's radioactive hydrogen. To separate that out of water, you can't do it by simple chemical processes. It's just the same it's chemically the same thing. So you have to use ultra high centrifuges or something like that. You're going to do something like that to get the tritiate to concentrate that, and that's not very good. But let's look at what's the radioactivity of tritium. How does it work? It's a beta emitter. Its emission energy just dissipates within about an inch of water, is all it takes. You can stop it that easily. The amount that is there, and first of all, as soon as it goes into the river, it doesn't accumulate, or the ocean, as they're going to do, they're really going to release it slowly, dilute it. It diffuses it, it has its own mechanism. The way protons dissipate in water, they really have very fast transport. They mix very quickly, so they go away. It's not like they're going to accumulate anywhere.
Yep.
And if fish eat it or happen to, they generally stay with the water part of the system, and it just dilutes, goes away. It doesn't get incorporated into the organic molecules of the body as quickly as if it were to be metabolized and get into a protein and stay there and be able to give you the radioactive damage from that. So,
Okay.
so the overall radioactivity, the fear from that is, it's the PR concern is really big. But I fear that if those 100 million gallons or whatever the tons of water that's there in those huge holding tanks, should one of them catastrophically fail, we are going to have a much bigger problem than easily, removing it, releasing it in a controlled manner into the ocean.
Will it go into the fish that are harvested and eaten in China and Japan?
There's already radioactivity in the seawater. It becomes as dilute as having a few bananas. There's potassium in the bananas, and you have to start looking at banana equivalent of radiations. Here is what we are talking about. You can visit Chernobyl right now on a tours, and the exposure that you get will be like standing with 100 bananas for an hour. So I think our grocery workers suffer more, have higher exposure than.
Sir,
Hey, Carl has his hand raised. Let's go to him.
okay.
Carl?
Unmuted.
Carl, unmute you.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Ripu. That was very, very thorough. I appreciate it. I have a question about your basic energy conversion efficiencies. So early on, you pointed out that if you burn coal to make electricity, you only get about 1/3 of the inherent energy of coal into electricity.
Correct.
And it seems to me that would always be the case whenever you're using heat to generate electricity.
That is correct.
It must also be true in the nuclear reactors as well.
Absolutely true.
So what fraction of the inherent energy in the fission reaction becomes electricity?
So 20 to 30%.
How much?
Not all of it. Not all of it becomes.
Oh,
When I'm looking at the output of a nuclear, I'm looking at the electrical output. I'm not counting the thermal output. So there is plenty of thermal energy over there as well, available at high quality energy that could be used for industrial processes.
okay.
If you
So
want.
your 76 million, was it megajoules per kilogram? Is that calculated from E = mc squared, or is that the actual output?
No, that was based on just E = mc squared. So you are correct. I think that was based on, I'll have to do that graphic was very cute. I just found it and I thought it's not something, and I haven't I knew it's in the order of a few million times. It's the difference in terms of not in base of the, but we can calculate it also. 2,000 tons of uranium give you a 1 cubic mile of energy, as well as for coal, it is 4.8 billion tons. So there's a 2,000 factor over there. So
Okay. Did you mention the total reserves of uranium?
I did not. Because so the reserve, thank you for asking that question. The reserves is such an important concept that we have to understand. These are special, it has a very special meaning. It gives, in the common parlance, it gives us a certain, that's our endowment. That's not the endowment we have. That is the endowment that is accessible with today's technology at today's prices. So if I look at the uranium endowment, that is the assured reserves, what I would call as reserves, and use the once through method, and we have barely for maybe 10 or 15 years worth of supply. Okay, like for oil is a very good example. And now I have worked with this for more than 40 years myself. And I know that more than that ago, I used to hear that there's only 40 years worth of oil reserves. And today there's about 60 years worth of oil reserve. And in the meantime, we have used 40 years worth of oil at that price. What has happened is we have found more, the prices have changed, the technology has changed. Also, you don't have to stick with the once through process. As I said, what we have accumulated over the last 70 years that is sitting in these casks and all that throughout, you got a lot of uranium that is, or potential fuel that is available over there to last you hundreds of years. There's more uranium that is possible from other sources. The estimates that they give us right now, if you allow the price to be doubled, instead of what they use, about $80 a ton to $160 a ton, then prices may be a little different, the numbers maybe, I may be off in that, but just doubling the price of uranium does not factor much into the cost of electricity. It's only a very, very small part. Most of the cost of electricity from nuclear is a result of what is the operations, the salaries and all that. It's not much to do with the cost of uranium. But doubling the price of uranium increases the supply by 10 times.
What about thorium?
Thorium is even more abundantly available. And there's a lot of it. So really it'll last us for, and I will say long enough that even we'll have fusion energy by then. I had to say. Yes. Who is controlling? Okay, Harold.
Hey,
go ahead.
Paul has a question with a raised hand.
Yeah, you may have mentioned it. What's the lifespan of a plant? That's been a question. Or what do you do when the plant's has to be shut down?
Good question. So the plants are designed, or first they are given for about 40 years lifetime. But it doesn't mean that in 40 years they're dead. They are running, they just were given, you have normal maintenance, things that goes on. You can certainly, and many plants have been given 20 years extension. There's no reason not to give them another 20 years extension. It's not that with proper maintenance, they can be running for 80 years.
One of the problems, though, I understood that the containment vehicles degrade because of constant radiation exposure.
There may be an ultimate limit to this, that you don't go beyond 80, I would say, but 80 is, that's, or 60 is certainly 3 times longer than most other things that last for about 20 years that are guaranteed for that. Solar panels or things, and then they are not recyclable. The waste that they produce is, at least we don't have proper methods for fiberglass reinforced plastics that are used for the blades and all that. And so you can see the graveyards of those piling up, like the tires that we used to get also, the canyons filled with tires.
Cool. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah. Neil.
Who you calling on? Please call on Harold.
Yeah, with the Fukushima Daiichi, the one in Japan. What I'm wondering about is how do we provide incentives for people to really take reasonable safety precautions? In other words, if they had cited the fuel for the emergency power shutdown and cited those things so they wouldn't have gotten taken out in the tsunami, it would have been a non-event. And what I'm just troubled by is not the power itself. I'm actually all for nuclear and involve my students in pro-con debates in the climate change class. But if the CEO is looking at quarter to quarter or their 10-year time in there, and you have that magnitude 9 earthquake generating the tsunami, which is certainly predictable and has a few % chance there, how do we force good behavior on the companies?
Harold, that's a $1 million question, a $1 billion question, really. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. It's really remarkable, you know, that people would do that. This was known and they were told.
Yeah.
This was absolutely, and it was a non-event. There was a nuclear power plant in just about 40 miles north of Fukushima Daiichi, which was used as a refugee center to house the people, because it shut down when it was time, and it maintained its power supply when the backups were there available and all that. So nothing. It was a non-event, just a little north of there. And that plant, it served as a place for a refugee for all these people. So that's how do you change the mentality? That's a really tough question, but we really need to have a good conversation. Neil, you have your hand up for a while, I noticed.
Well, I think it's a wonderful talk. And to me, the most important thing you said was that we need an energy education. Our office, the government needs to tell people, stop being afraid. This is the best way and safe. And it's 1,000 times safer than you think. That message is the most important thing we could do, I believe, to get this to work. My other question is, if people are worried about fission, how about fusion? If you're worried about running out of uranium someday, how about fusion? There's hydrogen more available.
Yeah. Agree with you both. In terms of your first part, what I've been struggling with and finding is that just the scientists talking or the government talking are not going to work. I think all of us have to talk to our friends. People need to hear this message from people they trust.
Yes.
So some people listen to the clergy or the hairdressers or the friends that your beer buddies and all that. You need to have this really diffuse out into the society and have these big conversations that are very, very important. And you may not accept their statement right away, but you will plant a seed that they may want to look into it and say, oh yeah, I know there is risk in everything that I do. So it's a matter of comparing the risks. And you had a second part about fusion.
Yeah.
I would love to see it happen, love to see it, but until then, I don't want to say, you know, that
yes,
focusing on the safety of nuclear power plants has really drawn attention to the wrong part that means giving people scared. We use terms. We always talk about, it has used criticality. Now, it's a charged word. Being critical sometimes gives a feeling that, oh my God, something can go off. No, all it means is you can now balance and you have producing enough neutrons to sustain the fission. That's what is critical. But choice of words really sometimes they're out of context. They make a big difference. And we have really, with this linear no threshold theory, I like to think of linear no threshold theory as because they use that. And then the other part of it is they take low exposure on some and then multiply it to very large populations to predict what will happen, because they extrapolate it all the way down to zero. So that's something like, here's an analogy I've been thinking of. Let's say the probability of me dying if I jump off a 100-foot cliff or building is 80%, okay? Well, but let's say if not me, the 100 people, that means if 100 people jump off of it, we may have 8 fatalities, right? That's 8, did I say that right? 80.
Yeah.
But if instead of 100 foot, let's say these 100 people jump out of just a 1 foot, would we have 0.8 fatalities?
Probably not.
Well, yeah, because we have built-in mechanisms to repair our DNA. DNA is being broken up many, many times every day. And we have, so our biology has worked that out. We live with radiation, we live with some of the damages, and a low dosage radiation is something we tolerate. Yes, Scott, I see your hand.
Yeah, I think Booker has a question too, but Booker, do you want to go first? You were up for me.
Oh, all right. Ripu, I think that was an incredible demonstration of facts. I wanted to ask you about the small dedicated, distributed modular plants, whether that's a way to get into it. And I'm reminded of the submarines and the nuclear aircraft carriers. We've had those around, what, 40 years?
Longer.
And they're about what, 200, the aircraft carriers about 200 megawatts and the subs are about 100 megawatts. And we lost one, it sank, but I don't think that was a reactor failure.
No, no.
So
we have, and so that's one of the things that's one of the encouraging, or what gives me hope also is there are now many companies that are making trying to make these small modular reactors, so you can really manufacture them in the factory, maybe at a shipyard, and then deliver it all completely assembled to site, rather than doing one at a time at each site, which really extends the period for construction and all the testing that has to be done. So that would be that's a great way. And Rolls-Royce recently announced the plan to have 16 small modular reactors at a facility that they were doing. There are some thorium reactors that are being built for Indonesia. China has done some, India has done some. So this is one way also, as we build more of these, and we can learn by experience and bring the costs down also. So right now they are $5 a watt, but it could come down to, we used to make nuclear reactors at $2 a watt. Right now we haven't made any in such a long time. And part of the reason was that in the 70s, we had overbuilt so many that suddenly we did not need to put more. Electricity demand had fallen. I wasn't keeping up with it. So with this 3 Mile Island and the China syndrome thing coming up and putting a little stop on it, gave certainly 10 years pause. But after 10 years, it was 87, and that's when Chernobyl happened. And so just when it was about to take off, there was the thing. Then there was a renaissance of the nuclear that people were talking about in the early 2000s, 2005 to 2008. But then Fukushima happened. And that was a stillborn renaissance, if you will.
I think it was in today's New York Times about Cuomo shutting down the seconds of the Sandy Hook reactors. So he's bound and determined to shut that whole plant down.
Yes, and Diablo Canyon is also slated to be shut down. We keep fighting. I've been writing and I encourage everybody to, if you are, please write to your people. And the encouraging sign from the Biden administration is that they, in all their pronouncements, at least Biden has resisted using the word renewable. He calls it clean.
Yeah.
And I like that. Now, maybe it's all renewable that he's talking about, because it certainly fits with his renewable jobs. You know, if you have a system that requires a lot of construction, if you have an inefficient system, you will require a lot more people to work at it, and you can create jobs very clearly. Not necessarily the best thing for the society. The energy industry has to produce a commodity that others use most efficiently, effectively, at a cheap price, and a lot of it to employ and think, but not employ people within itself.
Thank you. Scott?
Well, first, great talk. I really liked your simple back of the envelope calculations. It made a lot of things clear. What happens if we don't listen to you? You know, I think we've been awash in energy up to now, and you're predicting a future where there's going to be a real shortage. And I guess I'm kind of a believer in the free market system, that it will come along and respond. Now, maybe it'll respond with fossil and it'll destroy our environment, or maybe it'll run out of fossil. But what do you think the consequences are? Do you think we'll have, like, you know, a war 20 years from now over energy, or there'll be poverty, or where do you think this would head if we don't follow your suggestion?
Okay, so I am not saying, even in I did not believe in the pre-coil theory. That was one of the things. I did not think that there's a crisis of energy, that we don't have energy. The crisis is that the source of energy that we have is going to give us a lot of problems. That it's not that we run out of fossil energy.
Yeah. It's that the world floods and goes on fire.
Floods and the amount of refugees that will create, and the displacement that will cause will look all the other things peanuts.
I mean, the climate change is the biggest thing we're facing, considering even presidents, everything. Climate change is it. And so what can we do? I can think of two things. Einstein, a brilliant scientist, told a great president to use nuclear power for something. It was the wrong, you don't like it much, but it worked. He paid attention and did something. Is there someone who could reach Biden and make him understand? And can he do, I mean, how can we change things? How can we change things enough? We have the other quote I'd like to make, the same president said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Yeah. That's very appropriate to what you're saying. Yep. You explained to us, we're 1,000 times more fearful of how to build a plant. People are more afraid of that Sieverts. We're afraid. We're afraid of mysterious rays we can't see. It's right. Magic. We don't understand it. We're afraid of it. How do we tell everyone in the country not to be afraid?
Yeah.
Who could do that? Gandhi?
No, I don't know who can do that, but I think we need to have honest discussions about it at every level.
Well, we have to reach out broadly.
We have to reach out, and we all have to do our bit. It's not easy. Hi, Harold. Yes, see you.
I think it's a large. This is a chat, and I include myself and scientists who have not communicated this well. But the way we've communicated risks to the public hasn't worked, because on the one hand, the public demands absolute safety. On the other hand, for example, the number of people killed in auto accidents per day in the United States is equivalent to a jetliner crashing twice a week. And we could make driving safer with a 40-mile-an-hour national speed limit. There are reasons not to do that. And we ought to begin communicating by trying to relate things like, flying is much safer than driving. Nuclear power is much safer than driving, a risk that you accept for your quality of life.
Yeah.
And the extreme example is this J&J vaccine. Even if the fatality rate is 1 in 100,000
Yeah.
per doses administered and not 1 in a million, or 1 in 7 million, it's a number that's just dwarfed by everything else. And we haven't communicated it. I also fault us, the public says, oh, R of 0.99. Yeah, that's less than 1. They said COVID will die out. Yes, it will take
time.
many years at that rate. We've got to figure out how to communicate this in
Maybe-
ways that
So
people will understand.
let me chime in a little bit here, if I may. So first of all, I mean, I agree with your general premise. I believe that nuclear is going to be a part of reducing global warming. But, you know, when we say things like, well, nuclear fuel can be reused. Oh, but it's not. We're storing it in big tanks. And you say nuclear power could be too cheap to meter. But it's not. It's more expensive than, you know, the public tends to get cynical on things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, you talk about the molten salt reactors. Well, why are we doing that? Why are we using Chernobyl style reactors?
Well, the world is not. Only Russia, only
No,
for the Soviet Union built it that way.
Yeah.
And-
But
and
no one's doing the molten salt reactors now, are they?
I see there's another hand up here, and Ansel? Yes.
Yeah.
Ansel, give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. I see your hand over there. I'll ask you to go, but let me respond to something about this. What you said. To Harold's thing about communicating, I think we also need to communicate the distinction between hazard and risk. Sharks in the ocean are a hazard, but they pose no risk to me sitting here in my home. Nuclear, that material in the rods is a hazard, but it does not pose any risk. That's the kind of thing also has to be clarified. So what is the hazard and what is the risk?
That's maybe kind of subtle.
It is, but it has to be, sometimes a hazardous thing, if it is stored over there. And in terms of why we are not building those other things, we stopped processing all the reprocessing, at least in the US back in the 1970s, because we were conflating that we were thinking about we're going to have nuclear weapons. And even now I hear it again and again, that it's going to lead to proliferation. Historically, proliferation, or whenever nuclear countries developed nuclear weapons without necessarily having nuclear power.
Yes.
You can look at US, you can look at Soviet Union, you can look at, and countries that have had nuclear power have not necessarily followed through with this. And countries who wanted it and who are desperate about it will get it, despite whether or not they have nuclear power systems. And the two are separate. One is more a geopolitical thing in terms of how you feel your self vulnerable to your neighbors and national interests. That's what guides the developed countries for developing nuclear weapons. France would not take President Kennedy's assurance that I'll give you a nuclear umbrella, don't develop your own. He said, no, I'm not gonna. I've got Soviet Union right next to me with nuclear weapons. I'm not gonna rely on the American umbrella for that. We're gonna build our own and be as a deterrent.
Mr. Malden has been patient.
Yeah, I know, please. Answer.
There are articles all the time on development of alternative energy sources. There are different types of batteries that don't use lithium. There was an article last month in the IEEE Spectrum on using ammonia as a fuel, because when you're done with it, all you get is water and nitrogen out of it. And so I don't think and you mentioned fusion. Fusion is also supposed to be safer than fission. So I know we're racing the clock, but I don't know which way it's going to come out.
Yeah, we are. It's because we are in the race with the clock is the reason. And we know that not taking the action correctly we are seeing the effects year after year. So much so, and we shouldn't be thinking about the last 5 years being the hottest in the century, but think of these last few years as being the coolest in the next century. You think of it that way, and you'll feel the urgency.
They're not calling it global warming, they're calling it climate change.
And there's reason to do that because it is not warming. Warming is I have heard this as a snide comment. Oh, they're just being politically correct. No, it's not because of political correctness. It is because scientifically it is not accurate to call it global warming. The effects are really because of climate change. It affects water, it affects droughts, it affects floods, it affects all kinds of things of that kind, and the sea level rising, and then the inundation. And with the inundation comes the problem of then we need more clean water. I mean, there's no shortage of water, but there's definitely shortage of potable water, clean water. And that will require us again more energy to produce it. Judy, I see your hand is up.
Yes. One of the things we have to realize is we've just come off of 4 years of anti-science and tremendous promotion of coal. And so that's what people have been exposed to. So it's going to take time, I think, for the new administration to say, okay, we have to find a better way. We have to move in another direction.
Yeah.
A lot of damage was done because of the anti-science movement, which I've been fighting all along.
Yeah.
So,
but this actually was even before the former president did these things. And it's, in terms of his support for coal, it was just rhetoric. It made absolutely no difference to the coal market. Coal did not. They had no chance of coming back. He may have opened the things for coal mining, but there was no demand for coal. Natural gas had really completely displaced it. Not completely, but really that was the big thing. Coal plants were being shut down in favor of, and they were being converted into natural gas plants.
Maybe the question is, whom should we convince? Maybe we don't have to convince people from West Virginia to believe us, but only those in Washington. Whom do we persuade to take this seriously?
Yeah.
2 small comments.
Yes. Yes. Who's this?
Booker.
Booker, yes.
Yeah. One, as I remember, the way you make ammonia is by using natural gas. So you don't wind up ahead on that. The other simple comment is that there's a rather famous small book called It's the Dose That Makes the Poison. And it talks about, it's not the existence of anything, it is the dosage. I mean, like, look at selenium, for God's sake. It's toxic, yet we need it, yet we use it in shampoos, and on and on and on. And of course, too much oxygen does you in, too much water, drinking too much water does you in. So it's the dose, it's not the existence. I agree with you totally on that point.
Yeah.
Hmm.
David has a question. I think you see his hand up.
Yeah, actually, I put it in the chat, but it hasn't shown up. We have a local company on Long Island that's working on advances in the technology of cleaning up the exhaust stacks from coal plants, electricity generating plants where the fuel is coal or natural gas. So my question is, if that technology matures more and the costs come down. The problem with it right now is it takes a bit of the electricity output from the plant to run the mechanism for taking the carbon out of the exhaust.
Correct.
If they can get that down to a quarter of what it is now, then maybe this is workable. So would this change the conclusions about nuclear power?
Not really, because it really fundamentally requires more energy, and because it uses it. And so the question then becomes, what are you going to do with the carbon that you have pulled out? What do you do with the carbon dioxide that you have pulled out from the exhaust? If you're going to do something with it, you want to make fuel, you need a lot more energy. If you want to make it and make it into plastics, you need a lot of energy. If you want to use, we just don't have, if I look at the market of how much stuff we make and compare it to how much CO2 we produce, so one of them is in the 50 billion tons per year, and the other is on the order of 1 billion tons a year. So there's a big disparity between or actually individually they're in the millions of tons. So there's the order of magnitude difference between how much of that CO2 that you collect you can fruitfully use without spending a whole lot more energy to make it useful. And so the way to do it is to then sequester it. So you have to bury it in ground somewhere. There may be methods. This will take time to develop. We don't have a good method. People have talked about it for quite a while. And yeah, so CCS, but carbon capture and sequestration is a viable thing. It could also be used to, take carbon out of the air. Of course, taking it out of the air requires even more energy, but these are all options that do exist, and they become more viable if we have cheap, clean source of energy.
All right.
That brings me back to nuclear power.
Yep. All right.
So if I can have one last word from you, I want to pledge from all of you, you will talk to your friends. And if you have students or something like that, got lots of videos on YouTube and things like that, call me. I'm more than happy to talk to students, more than happy to give lectures to classes and things like that.
Good. Thank you. This is a very interesting talk, and love it if you could come back and give another one, a follow-up at some point.
I agree.
I agree. Yeah.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm going to
Thank you.
talk to my class later this month or next month. That would be great.
You have my contact information.
Where do you live, Ripudaman? What state do you live in?
Oh, I'm in Oregon. I'm not far from Bruce's place, actually.
You're some distance from Long Island, though.
We haven't seen each other personally because of COVID, but we discovered that he lives maybe just a couple miles from my place.
Cool. All right. Well, again, thank you for.
You're also not very far, are you? You live by the waterfront?
Who are you talking about?
Scott.
Scott.
Correct. We'll have to get together after COVID. We should all get together. We should have a beer night in Portland. That would be fun, wouldn't it?
Right.
It's a great group, but I live in Long Island.
Well, not all of us, but those that are smart enough to live in Oregon.
Please see us here on the call still.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, very good.